Mr. Fukuyama, yesterday you said that Trump's foreign policy is not the same as the US foreign policy. Then I would ask question, how does the agendas differ? And what is Georgia's place in each of them?
Well, by that I meant that there is a large consensus in Congress and I think in the bureaucracy that Russia is a strategic rival of the United States and that the United States ought to be defending democratic countries like Georgia, like Ukraine. Trump seems to have a different opinion. He doesn't like Ukraine. He seems to really like Mr. Putin and doesn't seem to like his democratic colleagues like Angela Merkel or Emmanuel Macron and other leaders of democratic countries. Up till now, it's actually the government, the permanent government, that's really determined policy towards this part of the world. And despite Trump's preference for Putin and for Russia, it hasn't been reflected in actual US government policy. So for example, the United States under his administration provided military assistance to Ukraine. But now I think we're seeing that Trump is gaining hold of the policy to a greater extent. He clearly was trying to use Ukraine to bolster his own electoral prospects. This is what the impeachment investigation is all about. And that's really now the nub of this big conflict between the House of Representatives controlled by the Democrats and the Trump administration.
The US is a strategic partner of Georgia, and mostly it is perceived as some kind of guarantee for supporting Georgia, its security. And also we know the US is the strong supporter of Georgia's NATO integration. What could have helped to activate this process of integration? I mean, on the part of Georgia and on the part of the US government?
Well, I think really the prospect for really entering NATO has been pretty low ever since the war in 2008, because an Article 5 guarantee, I think, is something that was very difficult to actually grant to Georgia, given the proximity of Russia and the fact that Russia is occupying Georgian territory and that sort of thing. And I'm not sure that there was an alternative policy that would have accelerated this kind of entry into NATO. Whatever guarantees would have to be of a more informal nature, I think.
As far as we have time shortage, I have to skip to different topics. You said that, and it sounded more than a joke, that several oligarchs are better than one. What's wrong with the one in Georgia?
Well, I think the problem with oligarchic power is the same in every country, that they have wealth and they're able to use that wealth to buy political influence, but it's not democratically accountable and it's not transparent. And so people don't really understand how that influence is being used. They have no way of holding it accountable. Because an oligarch isn't elected necessarily, there's no way to vote them out of office. And so I think it tends to undermine democracy itself.
Why is several are better?
Well, I think that in Ukraine, the different oligarchs have different interests and sometimes they're competing. For example, they all control different TV channels, and so oftentimes that competition leads to a certain amount of transparency because they don't all have the same. They don't have the same interests.
Polarization issue is very problematic. I know not only for Georgia, but it still persists in our country. It's actually permanent confrontation, what we see between political forces. Resources are wasted, and the problems are not solved. Problems, economic, political problems, country development problems. Could you please tell us more about damaging of polarization, damaging character of it?
Well, I think in the United States, there's such a degree of polarization between Republicans and Democrats that it weakens the United States. You know, we can't agree on passing a budget from year to year. We can't agree on passing major legislation for things that need to be fixed, like our immigration system or gun control. And it also weakens the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world. I think we've seen the Russians using that polarization to weaken the United States quite deliberately. So for all of those reasons, I think it's really probably the most serious political problem that we face.
You said that Russia uses, maybe I'm not quoting accurately, but uses weak battlefields for its purposes. What can a country like Georgia do to become stronger against Russian influence?
I think that
besides the defense issues and.
Well, I think the main battlefield actually now is in cyberspace. With the use of social media, with the use of all sorts of digital means of influencing other people's elections. And the only thing you can do is defend yourself. You need to be vigilant, you need to invest in cybersecurity and making sure that these attacks on Georgia are shut off once they're detected, that there's adequate ways of guarding people's privacy and the privacy of organizations, things of that sort.
We are heading to the parliamentary elections next year, and we are already in this phase of pre-election time. Now, what is the main risk, main threat for Georgia's internal politics?
Well, I think there are several things. Probably the biggest one is Russian interference, because clearly Russia has its own favorites, to win in the election.
Not only in cyberspace.
Not only in cyberspace, yeah, but they're going to use cyberspace as one of the weapons for influencing things, and so that's a big danger. I think that the existing polarization is also a weakness, just as it is in the United States, because it's something that outside forces can play on, but it also means that there's less consensus within Georgia. So that also is something that I think will be quite dangerous for this country.
Do you observe that Russian influence increases in Georgia?
I'm told that it does. Since I don't live here, I'm not probably the best observer of this.
You come back to Georgia again and again. What is interesting about this country?
Well, I believe in global democracy, and I think Georgia, along with Ukraine, have been on the front lines of a global fight, to see whether a country really can break free of Russian influence and become a genuine democracy. And I think I want to do whatever I can to help in that process.
I haven't heard that many people in Georgia, in political circles or analysts, would discuss China issue. Mm-hmm. And you raise this issue every time you have a chance. Why? What is that based on? Just to explain to the audience.
China is an authoritarian power. It's now seeking to project that model internationally. It may have a larger economy than the United States in a few years. And in the long run, I think that's going to be a big threat to democratic countries all over the world. They're more cautious than Russia is, but in a way that makes them more dangerous, because it means that there's not an awareness of the long-term threat to democratic values that they pose.
Not in Georgia, as I said, not in Georgia, I said, but is there enough discussion, enough work on that issue internationally?
I think it depends where you live. I think in Europe there tends to be an ignorance of China, simply because China seems very far away, although it is beginning to exert quite a lot of influence in Eastern Europe. I think if you're in Asia, it's impossible to ignore China, just because it's such a dominant player there.
And finally, again, Georgia, does it differ when you look at the country from the outside and when you are getting aware of the situation of it from the inside, when you have a chance to be here?
I think that any country, when you visit it, you learn things that you would not learn otherwise. I think because Georgia is a small country, the reporting on it is really not that extensive. So I do rely on visiting the country to really, talk to people, all of my friends in Georgia, to, try to understand better what's happening.
What about this effort, your personal effort in being initiator and one of the organizers of this LED program? Why do you spend time on that? And about the center also, Democracy Frontline Center, where we sit now.
I think that, people that want a kind of Western-oriented democracy need support. And as an academic, I'm not sure I can give very useful advice, but I can provide some educational support. And I think that's what we really want to do in many countries around the world, is to train leaders, leaders that will be able to use their skills to reform their societies, to make things better, and to make them more democratic. So that's really what my motive is.
Yeah, thank you very much.